Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
Welcome to Story by Story, sharing the human experience. I'm Kate Dudding, and today my co-host is Margaret French from Saratoga Springs. Welcome, Margaret.
Well, thank you, Kate. It's nice to be here.
Oh, I'm glad you could come. Margaret has been on our show as the featured teller, and now she's the featured co-host. Margaret, you were mentioning before we started up that while you are a storyteller and a writer, you're branching out this summer into a new, I believe, adventure. Tell us about that.
Well, it's definitely a new adventure for me. Courtney Reed, who's an instructor at professor at Adirondack Community College, has written a play which has won a competition, and her play will be one of 21 given in Queens, New York. She was looking for people to be in it, and she's asked me to be the dying grandmother.
Now this is Queensbury.
No, this is Queens, New York.
Oh, Queens!
Queens, New York. We do
my
4
goodness.
performances. It's a lovely play, and I'm thrilled and a little nervous. I've never acted in my life, which I told her. But it's great fun, and I can hardly wait to be in it.
So rehearsals have started, or?
Rehearsals have started, and I've started memorizing my lines. Jay spends his evenings helping me go over it and over it and over it.
So
we dying grandmothers, we have trouble.
You just drag him into everything you do. I mean,
yes,
he was always on call when you were getting ready for the Avon walk. Margaret walked 26 miles on one day and then 13 miles on the next. And she has said this publicly. She did this in honor of her 70th birthday. Now, and she's done this before, so her mind hasn't gone.
Close.
But you spent months training to do that.
I did. It wasn't enough. It was wonderful. It was great fun. It was very inspiring. I enjoyed it a lot, but it took several days before my feet recovered.
Okay, and Jay is Margaret's husband, who was always on call when she was training in Saratoga Springs in case she needed to be picked up, and now is your lines coach.
He is my lines coach.
And does your character actually die?
I get to croak on stage. I am so excited.
4 times.
4 times. And if her play wins the competition, 5 times.
Oh!
Years ago, when my oldest son was a freshman in college, even though he was a computer science major, he tried out for a part in King Lear and got it. And he's calling me and he's telling me from Texas, where he went to school, about this wonderful play. He played Gloucester in King Lear. And I was saying, well, that's nice, dear. And he said, Mom, you do not understand the greatness of this. I get my eyes put out on stage. And I flew down. I watched the play. I got to see my son get his eyes put out on stage. But I think I've upped him. I got to die on stage. But it's a lovely play. I'm thrilled to be trying something new, and I think it's going to be a great experience.
So storytellers can do almost anything. Housework, we had a little discussion before, is not high on our list of things to do. But other than that, and chess. But I think I digress. Let's focus back in on storytelling. And today we have as our guest, Claire Nolan from Albany. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks for inviting me today. This is my second time here.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to be back again. I'm so happy that Margaret's here.
Me too.
And Claire is a native Albanian.
I am a native Albanian,
And
born and bred.
you rode here on your bicycle.
I did. This is-
Not that one, but
No, not this one, not my much larger one.
Yes.
May is Bike Month. I know that most people will be watching this in June, but remember next year, 2014, May is Bike Month.
But you don't just bike in May.
Oh, no.
So we have the walker over here and the biker over there, and I tap dance. But so, how did you get started in storytelling?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question, Kate, because it was actually Telebration. I can't remember what year, but it must have been well more than 10 years ago. I come from a theater background. Margaret's just getting it started into theater.
Maybe I can find someone else.
But I acted a lot in community theater at Albany Civic Theater and some of the other local playhouses in the area. And in fact, talking about dying on stage, I have never had the opportunity to die on stage, so I can't give you any tips, except my oldest son was cast with me in a Siena College production of Medea many years ago. Yes, and he was in 3rd grade, and he was one of Medea's murdered children. So not only did my son get to be stabbed by his stage mother on stage, Medea, but he had to lay there dead for quite some time. And it was very hard for him, but he did it, and he did a very good job at it. And then many years later, my youngest son was in a production by a local playwright called The American Dream. And it was a show about people traveling during the Great Famine from Ireland to the United States. And he died on the ship. And so 2 of my children have died on stage. So it's... it's
How perfectly thrilling, and what a gruesome lot we are.
Yes, and they enjoyed it immensely. Their grandmother did too. So anyhow, going back to your question about how I started in storytelling, so my husband and I went to a Telebration. It was when it was at the Empire State Plaza at the
Okay, so
Hart
that
Theater.
was 2000.
Or not the Swire Theater.
Yeah, it was 2001 or earlier.
Yes. And so 13, 14 years ago. And one of the featured tellers was Frances Berger.
Okay.
And I believe it was when she first moved to the area. And she's the Oklahoma twister.
Yes.
And she came on stage like an Oklahoma twister. Oh my goodness, she was fabulous to watch. And she told wonderful stories. And I'm sitting there in the audience thinking, I can do that. I can do that. I want to do that. So I was in a children's literature class at SUNY shortly after that, and we were told we could either tell a story or give a book review. Right. So I decided to tell a story, and I had never told a story. I came from the theater tradition, so I had to memorize my story, which was fairly satisfactory because I'm pretty good at memorizing. It's helpful in the theater world. And when I tell the story now, I find that I do it much differently than back 10, 12 years ago when I memorized the story. Now, a lot of it, you're storytellers, there are many parts of the story that we always want to be the same because we just like the words or we like the gestures that we use at that part of the story. But we also know that there's those parts of the stories that are just going to evolve. Each time we tell it, they get a little different, a little juicier. It depends upon the audience reaction. So those were the things I learned as a storyteller. But yeah, it was Telebration, Kate. Thank you very much.
Oh, wow, that's really thrilling. And I think Mickey Groper, who was on last month, she joined Story Circle because she went to a Telebration.
Wonderful. Okay.
So I hadn't thought of that as the way we grow. One of the ways we grow storytellers, but all the better.
Well, my mother heard Frances Berger at a Telebration many years later when I was telling at one of the Telebrations, and Frances told a story about growing up in Oklahoma, and Frances is one of 8 children, and I'm one of 10 children, and pardon me, she told a story about her, she's a twin, and there's twins in my family. Many large families have twins. And she told about she and her twin each had a younger sibling that they were responsible for. And then one of the children was lost, and it's a wonderful story. And my mother afterwards said, "Oh my goodness, I could tell those stories. I haven't." So my mother has also been inspired by Telebration, and she came with me to Pyramid Lake, which, by the way, is at the end of July. The Pyramid Lake Storytelling Weekend. We were talking about things that we'd like to announce, and at pyramidlife.org is I believe the website for that weekend. Is a lovely weekend of storytellers coming together and honing their craft. And my mother and my aunt, both of whom were octogenarians at the time, came with me, and we had a fabulous time. It was really very, very special. So that was a great way to bring storytelling. My aunt is she writes memoirs. And she has told me wonderful stories about my mother that my mother never told me.
And they leave out the best ones.
And if your mother told it, it might be a somewhat different story.
Well, my aunt is the youngest, and my mother is her older sister. And I'm the 7th of 10 children, so I can kind of identify with my aunt and the stories.
That perspective.
Yeah, and my mother is probably the most intelligent woman I have ever known in my entire life. She's a brilliant woman. She's 88 years old now, and she a memory like you would not believe, and just so interesting to talk to. And I imagine having her for your older sister might have been a little daunting. And my mother was very athletic as a young woman, and and I can relate to this because the twins who I mentioned, who are they're the ones who are just before me, they're absolutely gorgeous women, very talented, brilliant, physically active, just everything you admire in a woman, but they're my older sisters. So I kind of relate with my Aunt Mary.
Now I know, I just have an older brother, but I know I got really tired of going, "Oh, you're Kim Ike's sister." I go, "Yeah." And you had 6, you're people
well, there's
to hit on.
6 siblings older than me, 5 of which are sisters. So when I meet a little girl who says, "Oh, I have an older sister," I say, "I have 5 of them." Kind of puts it in perspective. But I did finally get a baby sister. So when I was 11 years old, which is a wonderful age to have a baby sister.
So Telebration was how you started getting into storytelling.
Yep. And my family is where I get a lot of stories from.
Yes. I've let's see, is Bob the one that had the BB gun?
Oh, Ed. My brother Ed.
And he was driving the car.
And the rattlesnake was...
Yeah, that's Ed also.
Ed.
And they're going through the...
Ed, that's Ed.
Yes.
Yes, Ed is rich in stories. And he's a good storyteller, too.
Okay.
He lives down in the Bronx, and I keep telling him that he should get involved in some of the storytelling communities in New York, because I think he would really enjoy it.
But who does he tell stories about?
He tells stories about himself, and he is, when I tell the story about the rattlesnake bite, which I could tell today, I suppose, I begin the story explaining that he used to live in Seattle, and now he lives in the Bronx. And he likes big cities because they're quiet and safe. So he works in New York, in Manhattan, as a psychiatric nurse. And his clients are homeless people and people who are mentally challenged, people who don't speak English. My brother is fluent in Spanish. He's also learning Chinese. So when there's a domestic call and the police call, usually it's called the Mobile Crisis Unit is what he works for. And when he's called in, when the police call him in, he goes in before the police.
So that must be
it's a pretty stressful job. So he tells some pretty good stories about what goes on in his life right now. So yeah, but he does thrive on living in the big city. My brother Ed is going to be in the Senior Olympics. He's a bicyclist, just like myself, and he's racing in the Senior Olympics in July in Cleveland.
Oh, how
so
exciting.
we're very proud of that. Yep. Yeah. He's the New York State Criterion champion.
My goodness.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
do you ever compete in your bicycling?
I've done triathlons, and I've done cyclocross races. And the first cyclocross race I did, I came in second.
Wow.
There were 2
I'm
women.
Impressed.
Well, I had a friend who came in both first and last in her age category. Yes.
It's very exciting. So that's the extent of racing I've done. I like to ride my bicycle for transportation.
I've seen you on rainy, muddy days.
Yeah, there are many of them.
Yes. Well, we've kind of circled around any number of topics, but let's come back to storytelling again. And would you tell us a story?
Sure. I was planning on telling a story about my grandfather, but talking about Ed kind of brought me in mind of some of his stories. But I think I'll stick with my grandfather's story because it is summertime and this is a fishing story. The Irish are great fishermen, and my grandfather, Edward Nolan, is no exception. When he was a young man, fishing was his favorite pastime. And even when he was an old man, when I knew him, he was 70 when I was born. When he was an old man, he liked nothing better than to row out into the middle of the lake, because out in the middle of the lake, a man can fish, and a man can think, far away from a camp filled with noisy grandchildren. When my grandfather was a very young man, just out of high school, he moved to Utica from Clark Mills, where he had lived all his life. And in Utica, he got a job in a foundry. My grandfather was a pattern maker, a carpenter. And this job in the foundry was a really good job for a man so young. And he liked the job, he liked the work, and he liked the men he worked with because they all loved to fish, just like my grandfather. And all day long, they talked about nothing but fish and fishing. They talked about the sunnies, those fish that are so easy to catch that many, many years later, my grandfather's youngest grandchild would stand at the end of the dock, armed with nothing more than a bit of string and a hook and a small piece of worm. He would stand there and catch several, still in his pajamas, waiting for his grandfather to return. Those men talked about the bass, those valiant fighters that when you hook them, they just make the catch that much sweeter. They put up such a fight. They talked about the pike, the pickerel, the tiger muskies, those monsters of the northern lakes that can get to be 4 and 5 feet long. Once when I was visiting the lake where my grandfather loved to fish, some of the children had found a dead tiger muskie. It must have been 6 feet long. I never saw the body because by the time I got there, they had buried it. But they hung the head in a tree so we all could admire it. The children arrived, they brought me there. They wanted me to see this prize. And the children danced around under that big fish head. It was as big as a large man's hand. They pointed out its many wonderful features, including the teeth. The teeth that had been the stuff of my own childhood nightmare. And then those children skipped off onto the dock and they jumped into the lake. The lake that had spawned that monster. They were brave children. Well, those fishermen that my grandfather worked with, they talked about their favorite fish of all, lake trout. Trout aren't too hard to catch. My grandfather was an expert fly fisherman. And they're really easy to cook. They're so delicious. All you need is a hot skillet, a little bit of butter, and maybe some lemon if you remember to bring it along, and you just throw that trout into the skillet and heat it up for a few minutes. Ah, it's so delicious. Any fisherman who returns home with a catch of trout is welcomed as the hero he is. So you can imagine how thrilled my grandfather was when he discovered that every year those fishermen that he worked with took a trip together. Where they would go, what they would fish for was the topic of hours of conversation at the foundry. But at last it was decided they would go up into the southern Adirondacks and they would fish for trout. I can't tell you where they went because my grandfather never told me. Well, the morning they were to depart, my grandfather woke up so early before the sun rose, and he waited on his front porch, surrounded by his gear. He had his fishing poles, his flies, he had his bedroll and his tackle box. He was ready. And he saw the car driving up his street, the headlights shining on him on his porch. and he walked down to meet his friend, and he helped him load up his gear into the trunk. He was careful not to disturb the case of beer that was already packed. And then the two of them drove off to pick up a third man who was waiting on his porch, surrounded by all his gear, and 2 cases of beer, all of which was stowed carefully into the car, and they drove up into the Adirondacks. It was a beautiful day. My grandfather watched the sunrise as they headed up Route 12B. And as they drove, my grandfather was disturbed by some thoughts. He felt like he had forgotten something, but he couldn't quite think what it was. They finally arrived at the spot where they were going to fish and camp for a week. There were several other cars pulled off the side of the road, and there was a beautiful camping spot. It was active with all these people pitching tents and building fires and tying flies and stacking up the beer cases. And then it was, as my grandfather looked around, that he realized what it was he had forgotten. There was no food. Nobody had brought anything to eat. There wasn't a crust of bread or an apple or a bit of cheese, nothing. And my grandfather, who was already starting to get a little hungry, because you see, until that moment, all his meals had come to him at regular intervals and in large quantities. He couldn't help himself. He said, "Well, there's no food. What will we eat?" And the startled men looked at him. And one of the men, who my mother told me that my grandfather had told her, this man looked just like Santa Claus with a big white beard and a belly on him. This man put a fatherly arm around my grandfather, and he turned him so that my grandfather could look at that beautiful trout stream that was flowing right past their feet. And he said, "What do you think is in that stream? We're going to be catching fish all week. We'll be eating fish." And then, because my grandfather was very young and getting very hungry, he said, "But what if we don't catch anything?" Well, this startled the men, but it was Santa Claus who recovered first, and he once again turned my grandfather around to face that big stack of beer cases that were now taller than my grandfather. And he said, "Well, look at this," and he pulled one of the bottles out of the top of the top case, and he handed it to my grandfather. And then he pulled another one out, and he opened it, and he drank it. He swallowed that beer. He drank deep, and he smacked his lips, and he said, "Beer, both food and drink." And then my grandfather knew they had nothing to worry about. They had everything they would need for the perfect fishing trip. And ever since we heard that story, whenever anybody is hungry in my family and there's some beer around, we tell them, "Beer, both food and drink." True story from my grandfather.
I think you have the most picturesque family I can think of.
Yeah, I don't know why you ever go to folk tales or anything else. But.
When I say the beer cases were stacked as tall as him, my grandfather would always say, "I'm 5'9" or 9'5". I can never remember which. So whether that stack of beer cases was 5'9" or 9'5", I don't know which, but it was tall.
And you call that the perfect fishing trip?
I call it both food and drink.
Both food and drink. Okay. Food and drink.
I'll keep that in mind.
Oh, I don't like beer, but I guess wine is close enough.
When I was
gin?
working on that story, I have a friend who is she's Kurdish. She's from Iraqi Kurdistan, and she has 5 absolutely beautiful children, and her oldest daughter is now a senior in high school, and I've known her since she was in 8th grade. Her name is Ala, and I said, "Oh, Ala, I'm working on a story. Can I tell it to you?" She said, "Sure." And then I got to the part about the beer, and they're devout Muslims. And I thought she would be a little shocked at my story, but she wasn't, and she asked all the right questions, and she was really quite a good person to sound a story off of.
I love the part about the Lake Trout, because when I was a kid and we lived in the Yukon and went fishing every summer, that's what we were fishing for, was lake trout.
And how did you cook them?
Cornmeal My mother would, dip them in cornmeal and pan fry them.
Yeah, on a hot
good.
skillet, yeah. My grandfather would cook the catfish in cornmeal for us when we were, catfish is very lovely fish. And he would
To eat, not to
eat.
look at.
Yeah, they're kind of funny looking, yeah, I guess. But yeah, he would batter those up and fry them in a lot of butter.
They were good.
Yeah.
They were very good.
Yeah.
Did either of you eat breakfast? I mean, so that's truly a family story.
That is a family story, yes.
Yes. And
Although my oldest sister claims she never heard it until she heard me tell it.
oh well.
Rather shocked me.
Well, sometimes when you're kids and older people are talking, you just go think, I know, I yakety yak yak yak. I've heard this, yeah. But it's now yada yada yada. But before that, it was yakety yak, and with eye rolls.
Well, that's why we have grandchildren.
Yes.
I was about to tell a story I might have told before, once or twice. And my son rolled his eyes, but my granddaughter said, I love that story.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I was a listener, as I bet both of you were. When the old people started telling stories, I listened. And there's nothing better than to be the listener that they forget about. And then you hear stories. At the lake I was telling you about, where we spent our summers, there were 2 camps, one next door to the other, and they had been purchased during the Depression, when you could buy things pretty cheap. My grandfather was a school teacher after he went to the New York State Normal School and became a school teacher. He taught carpentry. He was a arts,
Industrial arts.
Industrial arts. Then they called it vocational arts. But now they call it industrial arts teacher. And so he always worked. He never. And my grandmother, his wife, she was a 2nd grade teacher, and she became quite ill with breast cancer, and so her sister already owned a camp on this lake. It's called Lake Marine. It's right near Hamilton, New York, where Colgate University is. And my aunt already owned a camp, my Aunt Alice, and she and her sisters bought the camp next door for their sister. So because she was so ill, and it was a great way for everybody to be together so people could help her watch the children. So that's where we would go. So the 2 camps were right next door to each other, so our cousins were next door, and we all grew up together, which was very nice. But on the camp next door, not our camp, there was a lovely screened-in porch, and at night, during the summer, the old people would gather and play poker, which I thought was quite elegant. And because it was a screened-in porch, you could sit outside, and there was often a campfire outside, and the kids would be at the campfire, and the old people would be on the porch playing poker, and you could listen to their stories, and they quite forgot about us, and we heard some juicy things. Indeed.
Okay, well, let's take a little pause here, and I want to make sure we have time for all the stories. And this is the part where we usually talk about coming attractions. But in June, there aren't a lot of coming attractions. So we'll move right on into July. And on July 8th, I will be doing a program at Weowaka, which is just about 2 miles from Lake George Village on the east coast of Lake George. It was started over 100 years ago as a retreat and vacation spot for women in Troy who were factory workers. And now it's open between Memorial Day and Labor Day. And most of the months it's just for women. July it's co-ed. But you can stay there. It's right on the lake. It's a beautiful place. And they offer programs. And I will be offering a program on Monday, July 8th at 4 p.m. Julia Child, Cook and Nifty Wench.
I love your Julia Child stories, Kate.
I do too. They are marvelous.
Yeah.
And I proposed this because this was a place where they could have a dinner afterwards, inspired by her recipes. So you can find out more if you go to my website, katedudding.com, and click on What's New. And you can find out the whole scoop there.
My favorite lesson I learned from you about Julia Child, through you, never apologize, never explain. and loved
Yes.
it.
Yes.
And she didn't do that.
And that's good for storytellers too, don't you agree?
Yes.
Because the story I just told you, I left out a huge chunk. You don't know. The
I don't
audience
know.
doesn't know.
Yes. Yeah,
Never
just-
apologize, never explain.
Yeah, just keep your cool, or what Betty McCanty, I learned from her. She's a little more devious than I care to be, but when she forgets something that she needs in the story, it's very bad form to go, oh my goodness, I forgot. Oh, I don't know how I did it. Then you've lost the focus of the story, and the focus should always be on the story, not on the teller. And you don't want their pity. You don't want to go there. So what she does is, she just turned 90 at the end of April. She's done this for many years. She says, what you need to know now is, I don't have quite enough chutzpah for that. So what I say is, what you need to know now is that the mother is blind, or they were up in the Adirondacks, or whatever.
I'll often say what I should tell you at this point.
Oh, that's another good one. Yes. Once you have
Or
that
what
in
you
your-
may not know.
What you may not know. Yeah, once you have that in your pocket, I found I have a lot more confidence that I can handle most slips that I make in my story. Because,
Slips? You made slips?
oh yes,
My
oh yes.
goodness.
You'd never know it, would you,
Yeah.
Margaret?
Yeah, some paragraphs kind of migrate now and again, and I go, all right, I didn't mention that, and nobody seems to mind. So, but you mentioned Pyramid Lake, and I believe the dates are July 19th through 21st this year.
If those are a Friday through Sunday,
Yes,
that
they
sounds
are.
correct, yeah.
Unfortunately, I've never been. I've heard it's wonderful. Each year there's a conflict. This year, it's a really good one. On the 21st, it's my mother-in-law's 92nd birthday.
That's an important event.
Yeah,
You better
New
be there.
Jersey. So so someday. But the teachers are Marnie Gillard, Laura Packer, and Kevin Brooks.
That's correct.
And it's a lovely spot, I'm told. It's not plush surroundings, but it's very adequate.
Oh, it's really I think it's quite lovely, but I grew up in a camp, so I'm not one to...
Well, one of 10 children, so probably if she gets a pillow, she's happy.
But I have to say the accommodations are pleasant, and it's $130 for everything. Your accommodations, all of your meals from Friday to Sunday, and the storytelling workshops. I mean,
It's wonderful.
you can't do better than that.
And they're all wonderful.
Yes, and
storytellers.
Oh, they are.
Wonderful
Yeah.
teachers.
And it's a private lake. Pyramid Life owns the lake, so there's nobody else on the lake. No motorboats. It's just completely private, and it's a little piece of heaven on earth. It's just an absolutely beautiful place. It used to, for some of the viewers who might remember, it used to be Marion Lodge, and that was the Catholic girls' summer camp in the Capital District. And I'm sure many of our viewers have been there or knew people who went there. So Marion Lodge is still alive, but it's now the Pyramid Life Center.
And you see the website on our screen, and I can't say it to you because I'm not absolutely positive, but by the time this gets all put together, it will be on your screen, and it's highly recommended. And it's for new storytellers too.
Yes, youth storytellers are welcome, new storytellers, seasoned storytellers, and it segues into Women's Writing Week, which I would absolutely love to go to at some point if I didn't have to work that week. But some of the storytellers are writers, and it's a very interesting dichotomy, is that the right word? So when Kevin or Marnie or Laura gives us an exercise to do, as we often do in workshops, you'll see the writers open up their notebooks and start scribbling away, and you see the storytellers kind of staring off into space, so you know who's who. It's kind of an interesting thing to watch. But it's an excellent weekend. And for those who have the time, it would be an excellent week. And it's all the week following it is all women.
Yes.
And that's quite popular and quite lovely.
So that's what you have to look forward to. Next month in July, we'll talk about the storytelling at Schoharie Crossing, not just for kids storytelling. That starts the last Sunday in July with Beth Horner. I guess I'm talking about it a little bit, but you'll hear more about it then, and it goes for I think it's
Right into
6
September,
weeks.
yeah.
Yes, that I'm the last one on September 8th.
Oh, wonderful. I'll try
Yes,
to get
and
it.
Sandy
nice.
Schumann is in there somewhere, and Karen Pillsworth, and
I told there last summer. It's a lovely venue.
right,
And wonderful storytellers every
Right.
Yeah.
year.
right. So I guess I should put that on this too. Okay, not just for kids. For kids. To give you a heads up and plan, this takes place in Fort Hunter, which is just beyond Amsterdam, and it's free. They accept donations. They have cookies and juice afterwards. It's a lovely series that's been going on for approaching 20 years.
It's been, yeah.
Hosted by Janice Fontanella, who's the site manager at Schoharie Crossing. So that's well worth your travel.
And also, Schoharie Crossings is one of the areas that was devastated so horribly in Hurricane Irene. So they've rebuilt beautifully, but you can see some of the...
Yeah, and the funny thing is, just like with a forest fire, the devastation in Yellowstone, well, what that did was it cleared the areas of older trees, and then new growth has sprung up that wouldn't have sprung up in the shade of the older trees. Well, at Schoharie Crossing, the Schoharie River came and it washed out the parking lot, and it revealed the foundations for the fort that was there.
Yeah.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes, and so they've relocated the parking lot, and they're leaving the foundations
Oh, that's exciting.
accessible.
So it's a really interesting place to visit. See a huge piece of New York history.
Yeah. So there's, was that a good news or bad news? There are stories about that. But speaking of stories, I think you have another one for us.
I do. I tell this story because I first heard it from Stu Mendelson. Do you remember Stu?
Yes.
Yeah, he's living in Boston now. He was member, I believe he was a member of the Story Circle of the Capital District. And then now he's a big, I'm not sure if he is now, but in recent years he was a member of Mass Mouth, which is puts on the story slams in the Boston area, which is a lot of fun. So I first heard him tell this story at a Save the Pine Bush vegetarian lasagna dinner that we have every month. In fact, last night we had our May dinner. And we've been doing this for over 30 years. And I like this story because well, I'll tell the story and then we can talk about why I like it. Gwara Devi was a little girl. She was only 8 years old. And she lived in northern India near the Himalayan mountains. And in her village near the mountains, she could see the beautiful snow-capped mountains. Early in the morning, the sun would come up and the snow would sparkle like diamonds. She lived in such a beautiful place. What a fortunate little girl. And as little girls do, she had some chores to do. Her job, early in the morning, when she first woke up, was to take the goats to pasture. And then when she came home with the goats, she'd eat her breakfast, and then she had to go with her aunt into the forest where they would collect herbs and plants because her aunt was the healer of their village. Well, she and her aunt would come home and they would have lunch, and later in the afternoon she would go with her mother back to the forest to collect firewood. Gwara Devi was only 8 years old, and all this walking on her little legs was starting to tire her. One day she said to her mother, wouldn't it be easier if we just cut down some trees and drag them to the village, and then we wouldn't have to walk 3 times a day to go get firewood? Gwara Devi's mother looked at her very seriously, kind of like your mother would if you said, "Why can't we go to Disneyland?" Well, Gwara Devi's mother said, "Gwara, we cannot cut down the trees. We must never cut the trees. The trees are our brothers and our sisters. They provide homes for the animals. They provide shade for the plants that you and your aunt gather to keep us all healthy. But most importantly, Gwara Devi, those trees have roots that reach down deep into the earth and hold on to the dirt. And those roots hold the water, because without those trees, when the spring rains come, our village would just wash right down the mountainside." Well, Gwara Devi was a little girl. She didn't understand everything that her mother was telling her. But she really liked that idea that the trees were her brothers and her sisters, kind, generous, older brothers and sisters who didn't tease her like her brother did, or take her things like her little sister did. Well, one day when Schoharie went to the forest, was coming home from the field with her goats, she walked by the forest. And she heard a rumbling behind her, and she looked down the road and could see this long line of trucks driving up the road. It was rare that any cars or trucks ever came to her village. And she stopped to watch as this long line of trucks came, and they parked right next to the forest. Well, this was very interesting. And the men climbed out of the cabs, and they went to the back of their trucks, and they pulled out chainsaws and axes and lengths of rope. And they put gasoline into the chainsaws, and they started them up, and that sharp sound, it cut into that quiet air, and the birds flew off. And Schoharie, who was not shy, went up to one of the men and said, "What are you doing here?" And the man looked down at the little girl and said, "We're here to cut down the trees." "No, no," said Schoharie, "you mustn't cut the trees. They are our brothers and our sisters." And the man looked like he had expected to hear something like this, but not from someone quite so young. And he mumbled something about just doing his job and run along, little girl. And she watched for a little while. And she backed away. And then she turned around and started walking, and soon she was running as fast as her skinny little legs would take her, right back to the village. In the middle of their village was a big bell, a gong, and she picked up the mallet that was almost as big as she was, and she banged that gong, bong, bong. And soon the women and the children came running. The men were off working. And they said, "What's wrong? What's happened? Has someone been hurt? Who died?" And Schoharie, who was still shaken from her wrong, and her arms were still shaking from banging that gong with that big mallet, could only point down the road and say, "The trees, the trees." And the women knew what was happening. They ran down toward the forest, their saris flapping behind them in the breeze, the colors shining and shimmering in the sunlight, the grandmothers with the babies bouncing on their backs. They ran as fast as they could right down to the forest, where the men were starting to cut down the trees. When the men saw the women, they stopped what they were doing, and they turned off their chainsaws. And they looked at the women and the children. The women and the children looked at the men. No one knew what to do, but Schoharie looked at those chainsaws, and she looked at her brother and her sister, and she thought about those saws cutting through their bodies. And she knew what she had to do. She put her arms around a tree, and her little sister went to the other side of the tree and put her arms around the tree, and their fingers touched as the two sisters held that tree in their warm embrace. And then Schoharie's mother put her arms around a tree, and her brother did, and soon all of the women and children were hugging the trees. The men couldn't cut the trees, and so they put those chainsaws back in their trucks, and they coiled up the lengths of rope, and they put their axes back in the trucks, and they climbed into the cabs, and they drove back down the mountain. The women and children stayed there with the trees until they could no longer hear the diesel engines. And then, laughing and cheering, they danced back to the village. And when the men came home that night, they held a big feast to celebrate their peaceful victory. That was in March of 1974. And today we call that the Chipko movement, which means to hug, tree huggers in Hindi. And that movement spread all throughout India, and it has spread all around the world. And it all started with the brave act of one little girl who hugged the trees. Schoharie and the tree huggers.
Oh,
Very nice.
Thank you. Thank you. But now we have to rush because Margaret has a story to share
wonderful.
too. So, Margaret, will you tell us a story?
I would love to. Today I'd like to tell a folk tale. Usually I tell personal tales, but once in a while I like a good, humdinger of a folktale, and I think you'll like this one. Rosalind Curvin has a wonderful version of this in a book called English Fairy Tales and Legends. Here's my version. Off the northeast coast of England, there is a huge rock that sits in the ocean. And on that rock, there is a castle. And long ago, and once upon a time, a king lived in that castle. His wife had died years before. He had a daughter, the Princess Margaret, but she was growing up, and he wanted to marry again. So he went off to find a new wife. And would you believe? He was back in a week with a brand new wife. Everyone was rather shocked. Granted, she was beautiful, and she was witty, and he was obviously smitten. But within a month, everyone else in the kingdom couldn't stand the sight of her because she was also spiteful and selfish and cruel. She was especially cruel to the Princess Margaret. The entire Cinderella bit. Gone were her pretty clothes, gone were all her privileges. Well, the king and the queen decided to have a fancy ball. Everyone who was anyone was invited. And as each person arrived, they went to the king, they went to the queen, they swore their undying allegiance. They said to the king how beautiful the new queen was. She smiled. One person came that no one knew. His name was Young Knight of the Wind. And he went to the king. He swore his allegiance. And then he ignored the beautiful queen, walked across the room to find sitting in the corner the Princess Margaret, and he said, "I have come from afar to see you. And it is true what they say. You are the most beautiful woman in all the world." The queen was not pleased. She said to the guards, "Seize that young man, tie him, gag him, throw him in a rowboat without oars, and set him adrift in the rocky ocean, where we hope he will be smashed to death on the rocks." The guards obeyed her immediately, and everyone at the party went home. It broke the party. And that night, when everyone was asleep, the queen went downstairs to a secret room she knew about, where she kept all her books of magic charms and spells and herbs and potions and poisons. Because you've got to know, she was not just the queen. She was a wicked witch. And the only reason the king was so much in love with her was because she slipped a love potion into his drink every night. Well, that next morning when the princess woke up, she felt terrible. She felt strange. Her shoulders were pushing up against the ceiling of the room, and her head was pushed down. And as she started to move, she broke through the walls of her bedroom, and her long tail, for by now she had a long tail, was swishing behind her, leaving a trail of stinking slime. She got down the stairs, breathing out smoke and flames. When she got to the door of the castle, the king turned to his wife, that magic love potion completely broken, and said, "What have you done to my daughter?" And the queen said, "Fool, can't you see? I've changed her into a dragon." Well, meanwhile, the knight, who had been set adrift, somehow managed to avoid all those rocks around the castle and drifted all the way to Norway, where he was rescued and served the king and collected a little store of gold. But he never forgot the princess. And everyone who came from that castle of Bamberg, he asked, "Have you heard any news?" Finally, a traveler came who was from the village, and he said, I've come from there. He said, "I hope I never go back." He said, "There's a dreadful dragon, lives there now. All the land around has been scorched, and the dragon has eaten every sheep and cow and every bit of poultry that lives. People are starving." And the knight said, "Well, the king has many brave knights. Why doesn't he do something about the dragon?" And the traveler said, "Oh, the king can't forget that that dragon used to be his daughter." Well, the young knight wasted no time. He took some of his gold. He went to visit a wise woman in the village. He asked what he could do about the dragon and about the witch. He knew he wasn't strong enough on his own. And the old woman says, "There are things you can do. First of all, you must build your boat out of the wood of the rowan tree, because only the wood of the rowan tree is strong enough to protect you from witchcraft. And next, when you see the dragon, you will be afraid, because the dragon is a fearsome thing. But you must remember who the dragon used to be. And finally, don't forget about the witch." Well, the young knight built a boat out of the rowan tree, and he sailed back, and as he got close, the witch caused great storms in the ocean around the castle. But his boat stayed strong, and he landed safely on shore. When he got on shore, he looked around. Everywhere he looked, the land was scorched black, and he didn't see a soul on shore. He stepped on the sand, and overhead he heard a fearful, loud, whirring sound, the sound of massive dragon wings above his head. And he smelled the stinking stench of dragon. And then the dragon landed right in front of him, puffing smoke and bits of flame. And he was dreadfully afraid. And he feared for his life, and he thought to himself, "If I'm going to die, let me die fighting for my life." And he pulled out his sword. And then he remembered what the wise woman had told him. And he closed his eyes for just a second, and the image of the beautiful princess came into his head. And he put his sword down on the ground and the dragon did not move. He stepped towards the dragon. He put out his palm, and he stepped closer and closer to those oozing, stinking scales of the dragon's hide. And when he was close enough, he kissed the dragon's skin once, twice, 3 times. And with that, there was a giant poof, and the sand blew up. He couldn't see the dragon anymore. And when the sand settled back on the ground, there in front of him was the beautiful princess. Oh, they embraced. Everybody came running out of the castle. Everybody was joyful and laughing. The king gave the princess hand in marriage right away, and the princess and the knight were very, very happy until the queen came out of the castle, and she was furious. She raised her scepter in the air, ready to cast another venomous spell. And the knight remembered the 3rd piece of advice. Don't forget about the queen. He ran as fast as he could and grabbed the scepter out of her hand and flung it into the ocean, where it sputtered and sank, twisting slowly down into the water. And at the same time, the queen began spinning round and round, sputtering and sputtering, until people looked down. There was nothing left of her but a small, stinking toad, which hopped into a nearby muddy ditch and was never seen again. But the princess and the knight and the king and everyone else lived happily ever after.
Nice.
Well, that certainly was a humdinger of a story.
It was beautiful.
But
Margaret.
and such a satisfying ending.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yes, I
The
love
Wicked
that
Witch becomes a toad.
Yes.
Yes.
All the right people are punished, all the right people are rewarded.
Yes.
I think that's why every once in a while I need to tell a fairy tale.
They're very satisfying.
Yes.
Well, ladies, thank you so much for joining us today. We heard first a personal story from you, and then a historical story, and then finally a humdinger of a fairy tale. Mm-hmm. So you've had quite a potpourri of stories today, and we hope you'll come back for the next episode of Story by Story, Sharing the Human Experience.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again,